Mark readers, chapter 14, the Last Supper, the arrest, the betrayal of Jesus. A lot in this chapter, so we'll get moving. The religious leaders didn't want to arrest him during the feast, during the Passover festival, because at that time the city could swell from about 50,000 people to upwards of 250,000. So if enough people like Jesus saw that he got arrested, a riot could easily happen. They just didn't need that. So they were going to try and avoid it. Jesus is anointed at Bethany by a woman who came with an alabaster flask of anointment of pure nard. Nard was extracted from a root in India. It was so expensive that it might never be opened. It could become an heirloom that passed down from generation to generation, from daughter to mother to daughter, and mother to daughter again. Now, Jesus recognizes that you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you could do good to them, but you will not always have me. Here's what this does not mean. It is not as though the woman chose Jesus over the poor. That's not exactly what is happening here. It seems like that a little bit, but that's not what's happening. It's rather that this woman realized that Jesus was the supremely poor man. There is no more poor man than Jesus. The one who was exalted is humbled, and now the humble one will be betrayed and killed. He is the poorest of the poor. Now, here's what I want you to recognize for the rest of chapter 14 and how we're going to organize all of this material. Chapter 14 is long, so here's how we organize it. Chapter 14, not what pagans and outsiders did to Jesus, but what his friends, those inside, did to him. That's what chapter 14 is about. Chapter 15 is about the outsiders, the Gentiles, the pagans who will kill Jesus. Chapter 14 is about those inside, the betrayal by friends. So it begins. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, is set out to betray him. The Passover with his disciples, he sends them to prepare. While reclining at table, one of you will betray me. Who is it? It's one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the dish with me. Now, interestingly, Judas is not named or pointed at all. The question is left open. Is it I? The institution of the Lord's Supper. Now, Mark is hinting that this is a Passover meal, like in Exodus 12. And what do we know about the Passover meal from Exodus 12? Well, at that time, the meal was eaten, and while that was going on, there was the death of the firstborn in Egypt. The death of the firstborn so that Israel could be free. Exodus 12, 29 to 32. Jesus is going to now take that role. He is going to step outside as the firstborn Son of God, allow himself to be killed so that the rest of us can go free. He says he will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when he comes back into the kingdom of God. Well, he's waiting for us. He's not going to feast. There won't be a festival, a meal for Jesus until we can all do it together. Jesus foretells Peter's denial. It says they sung a hymn. Well, these hymns were the hymns in the Psalms. Psalms 113 to 118, they're referred to as Hallel songs or praise psalms. They chose one of these. He says to the disciples, you will all fall away. Sheep will be scattered. Peter says, I won't. And he says, you will. In fact, 3 times. He then brings Peter, James, and John into the Garden of Gethsemane with him. He asks his Father, not what I, but what you will be done. Now, he brought those 3 with him, this hour of prayer, this hour of struggle, this hour of heartache. He did not bring the 3 of them as comfort or as friends. They actually proved to be poor comfort and pretty useless friends. He found them sleeping once. He found them sleeping twice. He finds them sleeping 3 times. Are you still sleeping? The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. The betrayal from inside to those outside. Rise, let us be going. My betrayer is at hand. So why did he bring them? He brought them as witnesses. They had to see what was going on so that afterwards, when they could realize what had happened, they could tell it faithfully. The betrayal commences. Judas, again, he says one of the 12, comes as a betrayer. The betrayer gave them a sign saying, the one I kiss, right? Again, the one inside, the friend, is going to betray Jesus with a kiss. There's a number of biblical Old Testament allusions here, especially from the Psalms. It says at the end, they all left him and fled. All of those inside, the friends, they all betray him. They all flee. There's an interesting line here. A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth, ran away naked. Seems like an odd thing to stick in there. Well, Mark is almost certainly alluding to maybe a few biblical passages, but especially Amos, chapter 2, verse 16. This was a prophecy about the end of the world. Even the strong man will flee naked on that day. A young, youthful, seemingly strong man flees naked on that day. Amos was considering that day to be the end of the world. Mark is now combining, he's conflating, he's merging all this together. The crucifixion of Jesus is the end of the world. Again, we see that the temple, even the religious leaders knew that when he spoke about the temple, it says in 3 days he was going to build another, not made with hands. Again, the temple is Jesus, end of the world, as we saw in chapter 13. All these things are folding together. Here's a prophecy about the end of the world, seen now outside the Garden of Gethsemane. We see the temple again, as we saw in chapter 13. And here we see again another allusion to Daniel 7. Jesus said, I am, which is, of course, is, we saw this phrase in Exodus chapter 3 of God speaking about himself as Yahweh. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Again, end of the world. But the end of the world, according to Mark, does not seem to be happening at the end of the world. It seems to be happening at the crucifixion, what then makes us wonder, when the Old Testament sought and talked about the end of the world, perhaps it wasn't the end as we had thought it was, or maybe it's both, or maybe, as we said before, as we said yesterday, the cross is really the center of time. The cross is the beginning, the cross is the end, and everything moves out from the cross. As the chapter ends, Peter denies Jesus. Once, twice, 3 times he denies him. And he broke down and he wept. By the end of chapter 14, then, the betrayal from inside the believing community is now complete. He will now be handed over to the outsiders. The outsiders will now kill him. Knowing what we, the believing community, have done, the only response is to break down and weep. And so the chapter ends. He, as Peter, yes, also you, me, the church, the believing community, and he broke down and wept. It was fitting for Maundy Thursday being today that we landed on chapter 14, and tomorrow, Good Friday, chapter 15, and the death of Christ.